The plane hummed with the low murmur of boarding passengers, luxury newspapers being unfolded, and glasses clinking with the crisp pour of pre-flight champagne. Heather, known for her polished professionalism, moved through the cabin of the first-class section with her usual grace, greeting familiar elite travelers who nodded back with reserved smiles. "Good evening, Mr. Collins. Lovely to see you again." She flashed a courteous smile to a gray-haired man in a finely tailored suit, taking a moment to hand him his preferred sparkling water with a lime twist. Mr. Collins nodded, appreciating the small gesture. This was what she prided herself on, knowing the preferences, building a rapport. She was comfortable here, in this world of discreet opulence and silent codes of status. But her demeanor shifted when she looked up and saw the Thompsons entering. Heather's lips tightened almost imperceptibly as Megan and David Thompson made their way down the aisle, their young daughter Lisa trailing between them, clutching a small stuffed rabbit. They were like any other family excited for a trip, but to Heather, they stood out. She noticed the way they looked around at the space in first class, Megan whispering something to Lisa with a gentle smile, and David smiling back at his wife. Heather felt a flicker of discomfort she couldn't quite place. "Excuse me," she said curtly as they moved into her path. Megan looked up, momentarily startled by Heather's tone. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, guiding Lisa aside so Heather could pass. Heather simply nodded without a word, her expression stony. A few minutes later, the Thompsons settled into their seats, whispering to each other and smiling, their joy almost palpable. Heather observed from the corner of her eye an uncomfortable feeling bubbling up inside her. She walked over, barely making eye contact as she began the pre-flight routine. "Champagne or orange juice?" she asked, her voice clipped. "Oh, thank you," David replied, catching Heather's brief, fleeting glance. "We'll both have orange juice." "Lisa, do you want a little juice too?" Lisa nodded eagerly. "Yes, please." Heather looked at the little girl, but didn't respond. She turned on her heel without another word, heading back to the galley. When she returned, she handed David and Megan their orange juices without meeting their eyes, but she made no effort to bring a drink for Lisa. Megan noticed. "Excuse me," she said, her tone polite but firm. "Could our daughter get an apple juice, please?" Heather paused, letting out an almost inaudible sigh. "We don't have apple juice in first class, ma'am. Only orange juice, water, or champagne," she said, her voice laced with impatience. "Oh, okay. Then an orange juice is fine," Megan replied, her smile now forced. Heather returned to the galley, her movements brusque. When she returned with a small cup of juice for Lisa, she placed it down without a word, barely looking at the little girl, whose small hands reached out eagerly for the cup. "Thank you," Lisa chirped. Heather didn't respond, her focus already on the other passengers. The Thompsons exchanged a glance, a hint of unease flickering across Megan's face. David reached over, gently squeezing his wife's hand, signaling her to stay calm. "Let's just enjoy the flight," he murmured to her. They tried. They attempted to enjoy their first-class experience, even though Heather's attitude continued to cast a shadow over their excitement. When Heather returned with meal options for the cabin, her tone remained brisk and impersonal. "For tonight's dinner service, we have 2 options," she announced to the first-class cabin, her eyes scanning every row except the Thompsons. "A roasted salmon with herb sauce, or a filet mignon with rosemary potatoes. I'll come around to take your selections shortly." Heather moved down the rows, engaging with each passenger warmly, exchanging pleasant smiles, noting their meal preferences. But when she reached the Thompsons, her expression turned neutral, even distant. "Salmon or filet?" she asked. David looked at his wife before replying. "2 fillets, please. And would it be possible to get a child's meal for our daughter?" Heather's eyes flicked over to Lisa for a split second before settling back on David, her face unreadable. "We don't serve children's meals in first class," she replied curtly. Megan's face tightened, but she forced a polite nod. "That's okay. Lisa, you'll share with Mommy, all right?" Lisa nodded, oblivious to the tension, her little hands clutching her bunny tightly as she whispered to her mother. "Why's the lady so mad, Mommies?" Megan's heart twisted as she glanced over at Heather, who had heard Lisa's innocent question but offered no response, her face betraying a faint flicker of discomfort. Megan, feeling both hurt and protective, leaned close to her daughter. "Some people just have bad days, sweetheart. But we're here to have fun, remember?" she whispered, squeezing Lisa's hand. The other passengers began noticing Heather's demeanor toward the Thompsons. A man across the aisle gave them a sympathetic look, and a woman 2 rows up frowned, clearly aware of the cold treatment they were receiving. But Heather continued on, oblivious, or perhaps choosing to ignore, the stares. When dinner was served, Heather set their plates down with the faintest hint of distaste, and Lisa's tiny portion, hastily put together, was nothing compared to the meticulous plating she'd done for the other passengers. As Heather walked away, David looked at his wife, an unmistakable sense of disappointment in his eyes. "I'm sorry, hon. I thought this was going to be a special trip," he whispered. Megan put a reassuring hand on his arm. "Hey, it still is. Let's focus on that." Just then, Lisa looked up at Heather, who was clearing plates at the other end of the aisle. "Excuse me, ma'am," she called in her high, cheerful voice. Heather turned, visibly annoyed, as if Lisa had broken some unspoken rule of silence in her first-class cabin. She walked back toward them, her eyes fixed on Lisa with an impatience that didn't go unnoticed. "Yes?" she asked tightly. Lisa smiled, holding up her empty juice cup. "Can I have some more orange juice, please?" Heather's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll see what I can do," she replied curtly, taking the cup and walking away without a backward glance. Lisa looked up at her parents, a small frown creasing her forehead. "Why doesn't she like us?" she asked, her voice soft, almost hurt. David felt his chest tighten at his daughter's innocent question. He stroked her hair gently, forcing a smile. "Maybe she just doesn't know us yet, sweetie." Lisa looked thoughtful, then nodded, seemingly satisfied with that explanation. But as Heather brought back the juice with a sigh, the Thompsons sensed that the underlying tension was only just beginning. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight reached its cruising altitude, the ambient light casting a soft glow over the plush first-class seats. The hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses carried on as other passengers settled comfortably into their journey, while Heather continued her rounds, her demeanor icy whenever she neared the Thompsons. Heather moved through the aisle, stopping by each passenger to offer a selection of warm blankets and additional snacks. When she reached the Thompsons, however, her voice was flat, her expression steely. "Anything else?" she asked, her tone clipped. David looked up, visibly hesitant but determined to maintain civility. "Could we get a blanket for our daughter?" he asked. Megan, sitting beside him, watched the exchange with a quiet resignation. Heather barely acknowledged his request, simply nodding and walking away without another word. Megan felt a familiar sense of frustration rising, and she leaned over, whispering to her husband. "David, this is getting out of hand," she murmured. "Everyone around us can see it too. I don't understand why she's treating us this way." David sighed, keeping his voice low, careful to shield Lisa from the tension. "I know, but we have to hold our heads high. We're not going to let this ruin our trip." Megan forced a nod, putting on a brave face, but the silent stares from the other passengers made it hard to ignore the unfairness of the situation. David noticed the glance from a woman across the aisle, who looked over at them with a sympathetic frown, clearly aware of Heather's behavior. A few minutes later, Heather returned, tossing a thin blanket onto Lisa's lap without a word, her face devoid of warmth. Megan watched as Lisa tried to adjust the blanket herself, but the fabric was barely large enough to cover her small frame. Megan couldn't resist speaking up, her voice soft but pointed. "Excuse me," she said. Heather turned to her with a hint of impatience. "Yes. This blanket, it's quite small. Is there a larger one for children?" Megan asked, holding the blanket up, showing its limited size. Heather's expression didn't shift. "I'm afraid that's all we have for kids in first class," she replied, her tone dismissive. Megan's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but she simply nodded, choosing not to escalate the situation. However, Lisa, picking up on her mother's discomfort, looked up at Heather with wide, innocent eyes. "Thank you, ma'am," Lisa said, her small voice brimming with sincerity. Heather glanced at her, the briefest flicker of guilt flashing across her face, but it disappeared as quickly as it had come. David leaned into Megan once Heather had moved on. She can't keep this up forever. People are noticing. Just a little longer, and we'll be off this flight. Megan gave a faint smile, though worry lingered in her eyes. Lisa tugged at her mother's sleeve, looking up with a quizzical expression. "Mommy, is the lady mad at us?" Megan swallowed, feeling a surge of protectiveness for her daughter. "No, sweetheart. Sometimes people just don't understand us. But that doesn't mean we have to be unkind in return." Lisa looked up at her mother, nodding slowly, trying to understand. David reached over, ruffling his daughter's hair with a reassuring smile. "We're here together. That's what matters," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. Just then, Heather returned with the dinner service. She moved methodically, plating meals with precision, greeting each passenger warmly as she handed them their carefully arranged dishes. When she reached the Thompsons, her demeanor shifted again, reverting to the cold, detached attitude that had marked her interactions with them since the start. She placed the plates down in front of David and Megan with a noticeable lack of care, the dishes rattling slightly as they touched the table. Heather didn't look at them, her eyes trained somewhere over their heads as she muttered, "Salmon for the adults, small portion for the child." Megan glanced down, noticing that Lisa's meal was nothing more than a few vegetables hastily arranged, a stark contrast to the larger, well-prepared meals served to other children she'd seen Heather attend to earlier. Megan looked up, incredulous, but forced herself to remain calm. "Is there any way we could get a bit more for her?" Megan asked gently, gesturing toward Lisa's plate. Heather's expression hardened. "That's what we have available for children," she said, her tone barely masking irritation. David inhaled deeply, visibly holding back his frustration. "Thank you," he said, choosing not to engage further. Heather nodded curtly, turning and walking away without another glance. Megan's shoulders slumped, and she exchanged a look with David. It was clear they both felt the sting of Heather's treatment, but neither wanted to let it affect Lisa's experience. They encouraged her to eat, laughing softly as they made small jokes, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy for her. But then, as Heather passed by once more, Lisa, in her innocent way, looked up and asked, "Why is everyone else getting nice food, mommies?" Heather paused, hearing the child's question, and for a moment, her face betrayed a hint of discomfort. But instead of addressing it, she walked away quickly, ignoring the Thompsons entirely. David shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It's almost amusing in a sad way," he said quietly to Megan. "Here we are, just trying to have a nice evening, and she can't even pretend to be polite." Megan sighed, resting a comforting hand on her husband's shoulder. "I know, but don't give her the satisfaction of getting to us. She's the one who'll have to live with her choices." As the flight continued, Heather's treatment grew even colder. When other passengers requested additional services, she attended to them with a warm smile, chatting pleasantly as she refilled their drinks or brought them extra napkins. Yet every time she passed by the Thompsons, her gaze grew distant, and her posture stiffened, as though simply acknowledging them was a chore. It was around this time that a man across the aisle, who had been observing the entire interaction, leaned over to David. "Is everything okay here?" he asked quietly, his face etched with concern. David glanced at Heather, who was across the cabin, then back at the man. He forced a smile. "We're fine, thank you. Just some misunderstandings, I suppose." The man nodded slowly, his brows furrowed, but he didn't press further. Still, it was clear that several passengers had taken notice of the situation, the unspoken tension weaving through the first-class cabin like an uncomfortable thread. The Thompsons remained quiet for the rest of the meal, their excitement from earlier dimmed. Lisa, oblivious to the social undertones, continued to play with her stuffed rabbit, her laughter and innocence a stark contrast to the atmosphere around them. As Heather glanced over once more, her gaze collided briefly with David's. Something in his calm, resilient expression caused her to falter slightly, her confident demeanor wavering for the first time. But she quickly looked away, pushing down the strange pang of discomfort rising within her. For David and Megan, it was a moment they'd never forget. one that would stay with them long after the plane landed, a reminder of the silent but persistent battle they continued to face, even in spaces where they were supposed to feel welcome. As the plane cruised over the Midwest, a quiet had settled over first class. Most passengers were either absorbed in movies or resting with blankets pulled up to their chins. Lisa had fallen asleep, her head on Megan's lap, clutching her stuffed rabbit, while David stared out the window, his face calm but expression somber. Heather moved down the aisle, collecting trays with her usual efficiency. She was acutely aware of the eyes on her. Several passengers had clearly noticed her treatment of the Thompsons, and she felt their subtle, critical stares. But she brushed off the discomfort, assuring herself that she had simply been following protocol. When Heather reached the Thompsons' row, Megan gently shifted, trying not to wake Lisa, and handed her tray over. David followed suit, wordlessly handing his tray to Heather without meeting her gaze. Heather could sense the strained politeness in their actions, but her own pride held her back from softening. She cleared their table quickly, almost robotically, but as she reached for the empty water glasses, something on David's seat caught her eye. A briefcase left slightly ajar. The tag, visible in the dim cabin light, read David Thompson. She saw the embossed name, and a flicker of recognition sparked. The name tugged at something in her memory. It felt familiar. She continued on her rounds, the name circling her mind, as if trying to remind her of something she couldn't quite grasp. When she returned to the galley, Heather glanced around to ensure her co-workers were occupied. Her curiosity got the best of her, and she discreetly pulled out her phone, typing in the name David Thompson. Instantly, results appeared. Articles, photos, speeches. Her heart dropped. David Thompson was no ordinary passenger. He was a prominent business leader and activist, well known across the country for his work in racial equity and corporate responsibility. He had given TED Talks, spoken before Congress, and had even received national awards for his dedication to social justice. Heather's mind raced, a mix of shock and something that felt disturbingly like shame welling up in her. She realized that she knew who David Thompson was. She had watched his speeches, had even followed his work from a distance with quiet admiration. She remembered feeling moved by his commitment, silently respecting the way he advocated for justice with dignity and strength. But now, here she was, treating him and his family with less than basic respect, simply because they didn't fit her preconceived notions of a first-class passenger. Her stomach twisted. How could she have been so blind? Suddenly, the reality of her behavior hit her full force. She treated a family who deserved every ounce of respect with disdain, simply because of her own unconscious biases. Heather's face flushed, and her grip on her phone tightened as she felt a cold wash of humiliation. Taking a deep breath, Heather straightened, trying to gather herself. She had to find a way to fix this, to make amends somehow. Her first instinct was to approach them immediately, to offer a warm drink, maybe an apology hidden behind some friendly service. But something held her back. The realization that any attempt to make up for her behavior now might come off as shallow or insincere. But she knew she couldn't ignore it, not after everything she had realized. She needed to do something, even if it was subtle. As she approached their row again, Heather softened her gaze and mustered a smile, attempting a warmth she hadn't shown before. David looked up as she neared, his face neutral but watchful. "Is there anything else I can get you?" she asked, her tone gentler than it had been all flight. David regarded her with a calm, almost detached expression. "No, thank you. We're fine." His voice was polite but distant, a quiet strength behind his words that conveyed a world of meaning. Heather's cheeks burned, and she nodded, retreating down the aisle. She felt a pang of regret, a growing sense of shame over how she had let her prejudices cloud her professionalism. Returning to the galley, Heather couldn't shake David's calm, composed demeanor from her mind. She saw how he'd held himself with dignity throughout the flight, how he hadn't once raised his voice or made a scene, even though he would have been justified to do so. And that made her feel all the more guilty. As the hours stretched on, Heather continued to serve other passengers with her usual efficiency, but she felt a heaviness in her chest every time she passed the Thompsons' row. She wanted to make it right, but the weight of her actions now felt irreversible. At last, the announcement for descent into Los Angeles came, and passengers stirred, gathering their belongings. Heather went through the motions, helping with coats and bags, her mind racing with everything she wished she could say. When she reached the Thompsons' row, Lisa was already awake, her small hand holding her mother's, her stuffed rabbit dangling from her other hand. David was busy gathering their bags, and Megan was gently guiding Lisa to put on her shoes. Heather knew it was her last chance. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Mr. Thompson," she began softly. David turned to look at her, his face composed, his gaze unwavering. He waited, giving her space to speak, but there was an undeniable distance in his eyes, a reserved patience that cut through her. I'd like to apologize for," she started, but her words felt flimsy, as if they were mere echoes of what she actually felt. David held up a hand, his expression calm. "There's no need," he said gently. "But I'll say this. Respect should be the standard, not the exception. Not just for those you deem important, but for everyone." Heather felt her chest tighten at his words, each one landing with a quiet finality. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words died on her lips. David gave her a small, dignified nod, then turned to his family, guiding them out of their seats as they joined the line of passengers disembarking. Heather watched them go, a hollow ache settling in her chest. She had let her own biases turn a simple flight into a reminder of the divisions people still faced, even in spaces meant for comfort and equality. She knew his words would stay with her, echoing in her mind long after he left the plane. As the Thompsons walked away, heads held high, Heather remained rooted in place, feeling the weight of her actions settle over her. She was left alone in the now empty cabin, the reality of her behavior casting a shadow over the rest of her day. For the first time in her career, she felt ashamed, not just for how she'd treated a passenger, but for realizing that the biases she had tried to ignore still influenced her actions, revealing parts of herself she could no longer deny. As Heather prepared the cabin for the next flight, the weight of the previous journey lingered in her mind. She moved through her tasks mechanically, her mind replaying David's words over and over. Respect should be the standard, not the exception. The truth of it settled deep within her, echoing in the quiet moments. For the first time, Heather felt like an outsider in the first-class cabin she had always known so well. The walls of professionalism she'd prided herself on felt thin, almost like a facade. The reality was that she'd acted out of prejudice she hadn't even realized she harbored, and it disturbed her. She felt ashamed, angry with herself, and confused about what this meant for her as a person. The other flight attendants noticed her subdued demeanor. Her colleague, Jenna, a friendly woman who had worked with her for years, glanced at her with concern as they waited for boarding to begin. "You okay, Heather? You seem a little off today," Jenna asked gently. Heather forced a faint smile. "Just a lot on my mind," she replied, waving it off. But Jenna wasn't convinced. "Was it the Thompsons?" Jenna asked softly, careful to keep her tone non-judgmental. "I saw some of the looks you were giving them. A few passengers even mentioned it to me." Heather's stomach churned. She hadn't realized how obvious her behavior had been. Her face flushed with shame, and she lowered her voice. "Was it really that noticeable?" Jenna gave a small nod, her expression kind but honest. "Heather, you've always been so polished, so professional. But yesterday, you seemed different, standoffish. And with that family in particular," she hesitated before adding. "Some of the passengers were even talking about it as they left." Heather closed her eyes, feeling the weight of Jenna's words. "I know. I don't know what happened. I don't have an excuse." She took a shaky breath, finally admitting the guilt that had been gnawing at her. "The thing is, I knew who he was, David Thompson. I admired him. I even followed his work for years. And yet, when he was right in front of me, I treated him and his family with less respect than I would any other passenger. And for what?" Jenna put a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes we have things inside us we don't even realize are there until a moment brings them to the surface. Maybe it's a wake-up call." Heather nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to believe I'm better than that. But how could I do something like this? To a man who's worked so hard for equality, for respect, for people like me to have the opportunities I've had? Jenna gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze. It's never too late to learn, Heather. But learning isn't just about knowing something. It's about choosing to do better once you know. Heather nodded, feeling an ache in her chest. For the first time in years, she realized she had work to do on herself, far beyond the superficial professionalism she had relied on. And she wasn't sure where to begin. In the weeks that followed, Heather found herself reflecting on the experience every day. She began to examine moments in her past where similar biases had influenced her actions, subtle judgments she'd made, small slights that seemed harmless at the time but now felt heavier with each memory. She thought back to the Thompsons, especially to Lisa's innocent question, "Why doesn't she like us?" That simple, honest question haunted her. It felt like a window into her own hidden prejudices, a reminder of the impact her behavior had on others, particularly on a child too young to understand. Heather decided to take action. She started reading articles on racial bias and equality, taking her first steps into understanding the ingrained prejudices that often went unnoticed in everyday interactions. She read about the impact of microaggressions, how small, seemingly innocent behaviors could build up to reinforce harmful stereotypes. She realized with a pang that her cold, dismissive treatment of the Thompsons was exactly the kind of behavior that contributed to a culture of exclusion and alienation. But Heather knew reading wasn't enough. She needed to confront her own behavior directly. She remembered Jenna's words, "Learning isn't just about knowing something. It's about choosing to do better once you know." That thought stuck with her as she continued to navigate her own biases, acknowledging how easily she had let her prejudice influence her actions. One afternoon, as she was folding blankets in the storage area, she came across an article by David Thompson himself. He wrote about the importance of treating others with dignity and respect, highlighting that equality could only be achieved when every individual recognized their responsibility in ensuring fair treatment for all, no matter their background. His words hit her deeply. They felt almost as if they were written for her, as if he somehow knew the internal struggle she was facing. Moved, she typed out a message on her phone, drafting and redrafting her words. She didn't want to excuse her actions or justify them. She only wanted to apologize, to let him know that his words had resonated deeply with her, and that she was actively working to change. Finally, she sent a brief but heartfelt email to David Thompson's public address, knowing he might never see it, but feeling a need to reach out nonetheless. She wrote, "Dear Mr. Thompson, I had the honor of serving you and your family recently on a flight, and I want to extend a deep, personal apology for my actions that day. I've reflected on my behavior toward you and your family, and I am ashamed to admit that I allowed biases to cloud my judgment. Your words and your example have inspired me for years, and knowing that I treated you and your family with anything less than full respect has been a wake-up call I intend to heed. Thank you for the dignity and grace you showed. I want you to know that I am working to address my own shortcomings and to do better moving forward. I hope to honor the values you champion by making a genuine change in my life and how I treat others. Thank you for your work, your message, and your example. With deepest apologies, Heather Williams." After hitting send, Heather felt a mixture of vulnerability and relief. She knew the email might never reach him, but it wasn't about that. This was about holding herself accountable, about committing to change. As the weeks passed, Heather started noticing changes in herself. She paid closer attention to each passenger she served, treating every person with a newfound respect, even in subtle gestures. She noticed the way she listened more attentively, how she made a conscious effort to connect, regardless of who they were or where they came from. One day, as she prepared for another flight, she received a response in her inbox. She stared at the email, her hands trembling slightly. It was from David's assistant, acknowledging her message. The email was brief but genuine. "Mr. Thompson appreciates your kind words and the journey you're undertaking. He believes in the importance of change and growth and wishes you well on yours. Thank you for reaching out and for your commitment to making a difference." Heather felt a rush of gratitude and relief. She knew that she could never undo what had happened, But she was determined to live up to the lessons she had learned, carrying them forward with a humility she'd never known. For the first time in her career, Heather felt a true sense of purpose, knowing that respect, as David had said, should be the standard for everyone. Months passed, and Heather found herself steadily growing into a new version of herself, one that she hadn't anticipated or even thought possible before that fateful flight. Her dedication to treating each passenger with dignity became the foundation of her work, shaping how she engaged not just with passengers, but also with her coworkers, friends, and even strangers in her day-to-day life. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when Heather, catching a rare day off, decided to attend a community forum on equality and justice, something she wouldn't have done just a few months ago. She felt nervous stepping into the event, feeling like an outsider, unsure if she even belonged in a space like this. But she reminded herself that growth was uncomfortable and that she was here to listen and learn. The room was filled with people from various backgrounds and ages, each person there with a commitment to creating a more just and inclusive world. Heather took a seat toward the back, hoping to blend in, listening intently as speakers shared personal stories and insights about the subtle, everyday ways biases affect people's lives. She felt herself nodding along, resonating deeply with their words. After a few speeches, Heather's attention was drawn to the stage as a familiar voice began to speak. Her heart nearly skipped a beat. It was David Thompson. She hadn't known he would be here today. Watching him, hearing him speak with that same dignified authority, she felt a surge of emotions, admiration, respect, and lingering guilt. She thought back to that flight, how she had nearly destroyed her own sense of integrity in her actions. But as David continued speaking, her guilt was replaced with a newfound gratitude. She was here today because of what she had learned from him, because his words had pushed her toward real change. David finished his speech, and a wave of applause filled the room. Heather joined in, feeling her hands tremble slightly as she clapped, realizing just how much his example had impacted her life. As the crowd dispersed into smaller groups, Heather noticed David speaking with a few attendees. She hesitated, unsure if she should approach him, feeling that perhaps it would be better to keep her distance. But just as she was about to turn and leave, David's eyes met hers. He studied her for a moment, then offered a small, warm smile. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a welcome, a recognition, perhaps, of the journey she had undertaken. Gathering her courage, Heather made her way over, her heart pounding. David extended his hand, his expression kind. "It's nice to see you here," he said, his voice as calm and steady as she remembered. Heather swallowed, a little stunned that he'd even remembered her. "Mr. Thompson, I didn't expect to see you here. I just wanted to thank you, really, for everything." David nodded, his expression encouraging. Growth can be a challenging path, but sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones that lead us to the most meaningful changes. Heather's eyes softened, and she found herself nodding. "You're right. That flight, it opened my eyes to things I'd never allowed myself to see before. I had to face parts of myself I wasn't proud of. But because of it, I've tried to do better, to learn and grow." David gave her a reassuring smile. "Awareness is the first step, and you've taken it with honesty. That's not always easy, but it's essential. I appreciate you being here today, Heather." They spoke for a while longer, their conversation touching on forgiveness, self-awareness, and the importance of continually challenging one's own biases. For the first time, Heather felt a sense of peace about what had happened. She knew she couldn't undo the past, but she could honor the lessons she'd learned by choosing to be better every day. Over the following weeks and months, Heather carried this conversation with her. Each flight, each interaction with a passenger became an opportunity for her to embody the respect and kindness she now saw as essential to her role. She no longer operated out of autopilot. Instead, she worked with a deeper sense of purpose, one that wasn't about appearances but about genuine respect and dignity. One afternoon, as she was preparing to welcome passengers for an international flight, Heather found herself beside a young trainee, Naomi, who was eagerly absorbing everything Heather had to share about the job. Naomi had a warm, curious demeanor, asking questions and taking notes, her eyes wide with excitement and a touch of nervousness. Heather smiled at her. "You're going to do just fine, Naomi. Just remember, each person who boards this plane deserves respect and dignity, no matter who they are or where they come from. That's what will make you a truly great flight attendant." Naomi looked up at her, nodding thoughtfully. "Thank you, Heather. I've always admired the way you handle everything with such grace and kindness. I really look up to you." Heather felt a mixture of pride and humility. She knew that the praise she was receiving now was born out of a conscious effort she had made to change, to be the best version of herself for others and herself. The journey she'd started on that flight with the Thompsons had brought her here, and she was grateful for every lesson along the way. As she moved through the cabin later that day, greeting passengers and guiding them to their seats, Heather felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She knew there would always be more work to do, more biases to uncover, more growth to embrace. But she was ready for it, willing to face each new challenge with an open heart and mind. As the plane took off, Heather looked out over the clouds, a quiet sense of peace settling over her. She thought back to David's words, his steady conviction, his belief in the importance of respect as a standard for everyone. She knew she would carry those words with her always, a reminder of the impact one person's kindness and grace could have on the world around them. In the end, Heather had learned that respect was more than a policy or a procedure. It was a choice, one that had the power to reshape not only her career but her life. And she was ready, now more than ever, to live by that choice every day.